Have you made, been given or bought a sourdough starter and want to know what to do next? Well, I'm going to go through all of the different things that you need to do to keep your starter lovely and active. Now, if you've made your own starter and it's been a week or two and it's been doubling in size for 2 or 3 feeds at least, then that is ready for baking. And of course, if you've been given one or you've bought one, then that would probably be an existing mature starter. So we need to look at the different ways to feed your starter. The first thing first is to remember that this is your starter for life. Once you've made it, that is your starter. Once you've created your starter, you constantly need to keep feeding it to keep it active and keep it alive. You will hear different phrases when people make sourdough, and they'll say things like, well, I've made my starter, or I fed my starter, or my starter's active. They're kind of describing the same thing. You always keep this very same starter, and then each time you want to bake, you need to keep feeding it every single day in order to keep it active. So all the time you're keeping a little bit of the starter from yesterday to create the starter for the next day. So one very important thing that you need to do is name your starter. So if you've already named your starter, do drop the name of your starter in the comments, and if you haven't, I strongly suggest that you do, because once you've named your starter, you can then start to be friends. And once you start to be friends, then this is going to start doing some great stuff for you. So there are 2 different types of feeding schedule when it comes to feeding a starter. So a starter needs to be fed a minimum of once every 24 hours. That's a minimum. So you can feed it more than that if you want to, but that does depend on your lifestyle and what your feeding schedule looks like. So the 2 different ways of feeding your sourdough starter is feeding it to bake or feeding it to maintain it. Because of course, on the days that we're not actually baking it, we still need to feed it every 24 hours. So on the days that you're feeding it, just to maintain it, keep it as small as possible, and that's where the discard comes in. So at the moment I've got a very small amount in the bottom of my jar, so I'm not going to discard anything from that. I'm going to weigh my starter and weigh my jar, and then I'm going to feed it so that I can maintain my starter. But if I was going to be baking some bread, what I would need to do is feed it enough so that I've got enough to bake my bread with, but also leave enough in the starter to be able to feed it tomorrow and carry it on. I do hope that this is starting to make some sense. So the next thing is to actually learn your starter. What are the stages of a starter? So over a 24-hour period, you will see that your starter at the beginning is hungry because it's been fed 24 hours previous. It's nice and hungry and we're going to feed it. And once it's been fed, it's going to take a little while, anything from like 3 to 12 hours, depending on how mature or how you fed your starter and how warm it is, it will then peak. Once it's at its peak, that is when it is ready for baking, and it can stay at peak for a number of hours. Once it's reached peak, it's then going to start to fall back down again. And once it starts to fall back down again, then it's hungry. And that is normally within that 24-hour period. And then we're going to feed it, it's going to peak, and then it's going to fall again. And that is the life cycle of a starter. So to feed your starter, you can feed it in a number of different ratios. The easiest way to learn to feed your starter is with a 1-to-1 ratio, which is where you have a set amount of starter, let's call it 50 grams. We then feed it with 50 grams of flour and 50 grams of water, and that's called a 1-to-1 ratio. In order to make more starter, you might want to increase your ratio. To strengthen your starter, you can increase your ratio, and also depending on how quickly you want your starter to actually double in size and ready for baking, you can adjust that with your ratio, but that's where you need to get to know your starter. And then the last thing is about discarding. After your starter is about 1 to 2 weeks old and you have seen it double in size, then any wastage that you're then discarding in order to feed your starter, you can keep that and then use that for various different discard recipes. So do give me a follow and do ask any questions, because I know that we've covered a lot in this video, and I do hope that you've got lots of success with your starter and that you can start to make some really lovely bread.